Good evening. It's Rush Holt again. Those of you who have been here at the Policy Forum today, this is you'll have to look at me and listen to me again for a few minutes. But mostly, you'll get a chance to listen to one of the outstanding science and science policy figures in the country. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the William D. Carey Award Lecture. It's an honor this evening to announce the Carey Award. The Carey Award was established in 1989 to honor the former AAAS executive officer, William D. Carey, someone whom I admired when I was a young scientist considering a move to science policy. Bill was full of good advice, and in his avuncular way, avuncular maybe is a little too mild. Bill Carey was a great figure in the history of AAAS and in science policy. Not only was he responsible for the funding of science through the Bureau of Budget for a number of years, he took part in probably any major meeting and policy-making confab for a period of decades. And the awardees, the selected awardees of the Carey Award are individuals who, in their own way, exemplify Bill Carey's leadership in articulating public policy issues engendered by the application of science and technology. We are honored this year to recognize Dr. Ernest J. Moniz. Ernie Moniz has contributed to science, technology, science policy in numerous ways in this country and around the world during a career that has included academic work, public service, energy technology, research and applications, arms control and security, and nuclear nonproliferation work. He's currently the CEO of EJM Associates and of the Energy Futures Initiative. Ernie served as the 13th United States Secretary of Energy from 2013 to 2017. As Secretary, he advanced energy technology innovation, various nuclear matters. It is called the Department of Energy, but it has extensive environmental and nuclear responsibilities. He worked on cutting-edge capabilities for the American scientific research community and environmental stewardship. He strengthened the Department of Energy's strategic partnership with the 17 national laboratories, with the Department of Defense, with the broader energy producing community, the energy using community, that's all of us. And he attracted bipartisan support to legislation that was actually passed, which is sometimes a rarity in the field of energy. The Paris Agreement, to the COP21 agreement to address climate change. And importantly, in connection with COP21, he led the initiative to put energy, science, and technology at the center of the global response. The COP21, even as it goes along without us now, has a chance of succeeding because of the energy technology work that Ernie Moniz injected. He also was central, in fact, essential to the negotiations of the historic Iran nuclear agreement. Ernie Moniz served on the MIT faculty from 1973 until becoming Energy Secretary in 2013, and now again at MIT as the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems, Emeritus, and Special Advisor to the MIT President. Excuse me, Ernie, while I go on a little bit longer in fulsome praise. Dr. Moniz previously served in the government as DOE Undersecretary from 1997 until 2001, from 1995 to 1997 as Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, with responsibility for the whole range of physical, earth, life, and social sciences. And at MIT, Dr. Moniz was the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative. For those of us outside of MIT who need to know, that's called, or known as, MITY. It's Ernie Moniz's MITY. And he was director of the Laboratory for Energy and Environment and head of the Bates Linear Accelerator affiliated with MIT. He received his bachelor degree summa cum laude from Boston College in physics, a doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University, and various honorary degrees and governmental awards. Dr. Moniz, I am pleased to present you with the William D. Carey Award. So now let me turn the podium over to Dr. Moniz, who can talk about science policy or Boston baseball.
First, are there any questions for Rush? Well, anyway, it really is a great honor and pleasure to be recognized with the Bill Carey Award. He certainly was, as Brush said, a force of nature in these circles, and it's good to be back here to celebrate him in this way. As I've said, as you can see, I'm going to talk about energy technology innovation and what we call the Green Real Deal. That should conjure up some other words that you've been hearing recently, but I'll emphasize what we mean by that. First of all, let me say that the climate crisis is real in the sense that certainly we are way behind being on the track that we need to be on in terms of low carbon energy to achieve anything like the environmental goals that were articulated in Paris and have been, if anything, brought even more sharply into focus in recent years. But I'm not going to spend time talking about why we need to do this. I want to talk today about what is it that we have to do going forward. Rush actually alluded to the fact that President Trump announced withdrawal from Paris on June 1st, 2017. Although I do want to correct, we're still in Paris. Technically, we are not out until the day after the next presidential election. So we will see what happens there. Now, that's obviously wasn't a good thing. But on the other hand, one of the very striking reactions, literally within days, was that mayors, governors, and well over 1,000 business people stepped forward and said, look, we're staying the course, possibly even upping the ante in terms of going to low carbon. In fact, let's see now, how do I do this? Okay. This is just an indication of mayors and governors who, subsequent to the president's announcement, said that they were staying the course to low carbon. And the most striking thing is actually the states, the green states, where at the state level, they may not have made a commitment, but typically the mayors of the largest cities in those states, for example, made commitments. So I think it shows something of the depth, and it's very important, especially when we realize that the reality is that, if anything, it's been states who have been in the lead in many ways in addressing clean energy and climate change. I also mentioned the business people. Very, very important. Again, these are people who typically are going to take long-term views in terms of capital allocation and the like, and they're saying, look, we're going to a low-carbon future, and that's where we are putting our money. So I think this tells me that kind of we can do it. The only question is, what's it that we can do? Now, the Green New Deal set off a lively discussion, even if somewhat polarized, and a discussion that I think that needs to be sustained through 2020 and beyond. But let me say what I take to be the Green New Deal is fundamentally the statement of one important fact. And I consider it a fact, at least. Whether you do or not, we'll see. And that is that in pursuing low carbon, we pursue social equity at the same time. That those have to be intertwined as we go to low carbon. And I'll say a little bit more why I believe that that's the case. So that, to me, is the real core of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, yes. I'll come back to the Green Real Deal. On the low carbon part, I'm going to give now basically the punchlines of what I want to say. The way we are going to look at pursuing the solutions to the climate challenge. Number one is we're going to take a view in reaching aggressive objectives in kind of the 2030 timeframe, and then actually talk differently about what we need to do for the deep decarbonization in the mid-century timeframe. Now, one reason for that is that actually tends to be the structure of many agreements. The Paris Agreement typically had 2030 commitments, national commitments. Ours was 2025, but typically 2030. And then a statement about 80% reduction by 2050. If you look, as I will in more detail, at California, same thing. We see many states in which the objectives are put in those two timeframes. So that's one reason. But a second reason, and the more important reason, is that, and again, Rush mentioned this, we believe that innovation is absolutely at the core of being able to meet any of these objectives. And by 2030, we certainly need innovation, as we will discuss, in terms of things like continued cost reduction of the technologies that we see, hopefully in the early stages of scaling up. But we cannot expect any breakthrough innovation to be material in a decadal time frame. There just isn't time to go through the development and the scaling to have impact. But turning it around, I will posit that there is no solution in 2050 without the fruits of very successful breakthrough innovation. And we'll talk about what some of those directions are. So that's kind of the construct that we will be presenting. Rush mentioned mission innovation, which was, I'll just elaborate slightly, the Paris Agreement, by definition, was the last act of COP21 late in 2015. Actually, the first day, the French did something very clever. They had the national leaders come for the first day of COP21, and not, as in Copenhagen, for the last day, where they could create all kinds of problems. So coming on the first day, it was great, they opened it up, and the announcement that they made as national leaders was mission innovation. It was the commitment to double energy R&D over a 5-year ramp-up period, and also to forge some of the collaborations internationally that could be useful in addressing different problems. And, we're not on the doubling track, although Congress did do pretty well in terms of energy technology R&D, especially for fiscal year 18. And secondly, the United States participated in a Mexican-led initiative with Canada as well to combine big data and high throughput methods to look at accelerating the development of materials for a variety of energy applications. And there are still things happening there. And innovation, I think, if anything, has risen in the consideration about climate challenges. So we do need to acknowledge, however, that as we say innovation is at the center of the solution space, that there are some serious issues that we have to look at. And let's focus just for the moment. The left-hand side is about some of the changes going on in the energy system. But what I really want to focus on right now is the right-hand side. The energy business, the energy industry, multi-trillion-dollar per year, very highly capitalized commodity business. It really is a commodity business. It's got very complex supply chains, big established customer bases, provides essential services for everything we do all the time. This is not the definition or the description of a nimble system waiting for a lot of innovation. In fact, it leads to a system that inherently, and for good reasons, has considerable aversion to risk, inertia, extensive regulation, complex politics, and what I would argue is, because of the nature of the business, it will always be that way. And in fact, as an aside, I'll come to this later, but I think one of the reasons why Clean Tech 1.0 did not go so well was that the entrepreneurs involved did not understand these basic facts, because they had been accustomed to dealing in very, very different kinds of systems. And the regulatory system, as it evolves, will be critical for determining how we put our clean energy system together. The next point I'd like to make is that, and I will come back later to discuss the energy innovation landscape in the United States and some of the things that we might want to do to tune it up a little bit. Next point I want to make, again, I'm giving you all the conclusions here. Next point I want to make is that it's very important in our view that we take a sectoral approach in looking at how we're going to get to low carbon. There is a tendency, for some good reasons, to focus on electricity. A lot of our state standards are for the electricity system, decarbonizing electricity, and that's very important. And we may see some other sectors, like transportation, like industry, for example, benefit from further electrification. But don't lose sight of the fact, for the United States as a whole, electricity emits 28% of the greenhouse gases. Transportation has passed electricity as the largest sectoral emitter. Industry is up there, and we can't solve this problem by addressing 28% of it. Even though it has the advantage, that sector has the advantage of being that which is most easily decarbonized. We got to go after the tough sectors to decarbonize. Like many parts of the transportation system, certainly industry, we can throw in a non-energy sector, but with a lot of energy impacts, agriculture, for example. So that's another issue. What we will see. Okay, the next point I want to make, is that we also have to look at the solutions in a regional context. There are many who offer one silver bullet solution. Wind and solar and batteries by 2030 and we're done. That does not help us move towards any serious program to resolve the problem. And one way of looking at regional differences is to look at electricity generation with different sources, and you see these very, very different patterns, especially, of course, with the renewables. Solar is just on the edges. California is way out ahead in solar compared to anyone else. And wind is really up the middle of the country, where there's a great wind resource and comparatively little load, which makes big infrastructure requirements. Gas and coal, as fossil fuels, are much more distributed with the population. Oh, but those are the ones that we're supposed to reduce the carbon from. And hydro obviously has very, very specialized regions where it contributes. So we can see just in this picture alone just tells you that, this is only one facet of the fact that there are enormous regional differences, and we need to forge solutions that are tailored to regional assets and to regional innovation capabilities and the like. So that's a set of statements about how we frame. I'm basically framing the Green Real Deal in terms of low carbon. As I said, however, the Green New Deal teaches us that we really need to look at social equity simultaneously with looking at low carbon. That can mean a bunch of things. For one thing, it's quite simply the cost of energy. The cost of energy is felt differentially by those in different parts of our income distribution. There are worker and community dislocations that will occur in any major transition, certainly including the low carbon transition. We're just going to focus a little bit on costs. And let's not get too hung up in the exact numbers. I think these are, frankly, a little bit too conservative. Oops, I forgot there's still this. These are Melanie's slides here. But for example, if we look at, these are the EIA numbers for levelized cost of electricity, dollars per megawatt hour, for a whole bunch of different technologies without subsidy. And again, I think that EIA tends to be a little bit on the conservative side, but doesn't change the basic fact. When we look at this honestly, we have a lot of innovation to do in the sense of driving further cost reduction. We've made fantastic gains with solar, with wind, but frankly, we need to keep driving innovation across the board. This is the 2030 story about getting these costs of new technologies down. And you see here, EIA has solar PV, utility scale at roughly 6 cents a kilowatt hour, $60 per megawatt hour. And these are now data from Lazard, 2018, last year from Lazard. You can see that solar PV thin film, they say they're in the 4 cents per kilowatt hour range. Again, I don't want to get hung up on these differences. But if you look down below, that's the real story. Battery costs have come down by a factor of 4 in this decade. We need another factor of 2 or 3 or 4, because the reality is storage is still a very expensive add-on to variable renewables. So this is one element of the social equity issue, because again, obviously, energy costs will affect those in different parts of the income distribution quite differently. Now, what's the policy that we will drive to address these issues? Well, I'll just talk about one. This is not necessarily a endorsement, although I kind of like it. But for example, former Republican Secretaries of State, Schultz and Baker, with Hank Paulson and others, they've put forward a particular policy recommendation. They say, okay, first, as economists like carbon emissions pricing as the most efficient way to address low carbon, okay, we'll start with a pretty good, solid carbon price, $40, maybe $50 a ton to start with. So that's the low carbon part, putting a price. What's the social equity part? What they advocate is you collect the money, and by the way, let's remember, let me call it, for round numbers, $50 a ton, times, say, 6 gigatons. This is serious money, $300 billion a year. So the question now is, what do you do with the money? What they propose is very progressive. Divide it up, return it to everybody as a flat dividend. And if you model that, the lower 70% of the income distribution comes out ahead. Whereas, if you took the feared, at least I would say feared, default option, boy, this would make a nice little dent in our budget deficit. That would be completely regressive. So that's just one clear example how the policy in implementing the low carbon policy, the low carbon approach, can be completely different. Now, they will go on in their proposal, there are two other issues that are a little bit more tricky. One is to bring in this price on carbon and remove a whole set of regulations and incentives. That will be the political art form as to what exactly that means. And they have a fourth pillar, which is to say that if different countries, including our neighbors, have very different policies, we should have a border adjustment carbon price. And I think that's a great idea. Don't have a clue how you would ever do that, et cetera. But that's the kind of a package of policy options which obeys, in my view, those essential points about low carbon and social equity. And so, about 2 months ago, with Andy Karsner, some of you know Andy, he was the Assistant Secretary for Efficiency and Renewables in the Department of Energy in the George W. Bush administration. He and I wrote a piece called The Green Real Deal. And what it's about, it's taking those elements that I described already, focusing on the need to build coalitions, which we have not done a very good job of, to be perfectly blunt, in the climate arena. Coalitions, I mean, incumbent energy companies, disruptors, military people who are worried about security. We can go on and on and on. Such a coalition can only be built, in my view, by respecting those earlier points that I made, being pragmatic, and not drifting to what I would call either end of the political spectrum. Obviously, the deniers is one thing, but one might argue on the other end are those who propose the kinds of solutions I alluded to earlier, zero carbon in 5 or 10 years. We may know that the planet would benefit enormously from that. At least a lot of us with a lot of flesh wounds know, even if it doesn't violate the laws of physics, and it practically does, that is the way to fracture an approach to climate change. So what we want to do, and at the Energy Futures Initiative, it's really in many ways right now our central purpose is to flesh out all the elements of a Green Real Deal that can attract the kinds of coalitions that one needs to go forward. But the person who in many ways defined the Green Real Deal the best was Barack Obama. And this is not well known. But in October of 2016, shortly before the election, he was on the South Lawn of the White House with Leo DiCaprio, What is that? Was that a laugh line? And Karen Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, doing a discussion on climate change. And I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I got to say, most of it was all the stuff that I skipped, how bad it's going to be, and all the climate risks we have, et cetera, et cetera. And it isn't that I don't believe that. I'm saying that I want to just focus now on moving forward. But in the middle of it, and I urge you to look this up on the internet. You can find the transcript of it. I'm going to read some of the words that the president said, talking to an audience of those they were clearly all committed very strongly to addressing climate. So this is a quote, although some with dots in various places. So the president said, "So if we're going to solve this problem, climate problem, then we're going to need some remarkable innovation. We're still going to need some really big technological breakthroughs. But with the technology that we have right now, my goal has been to build that bridge to this clean energy future, to make sure that over the next 20 years, I'll use 11, using existing technologies, we do everything we can so that by the time those breakthroughs are ready, we haven't already created an irreversible problem. And that's going to require mobilization. To do that, I think it's important for those of us who care deeply about this to not be dismissive of people's concerns when it comes to what will this mean for me and my family. So, if you're a working class family and dad has to drive 50 miles to get to his job and he can't afford to buy a Tesla, and the most important thing to him economically to make sure he can pay the bills at the end of the month is the price of gas. And when gas prices are low, that means an extra $100 in his pocket or $200, and that may make the difference about whether or not he can buy enough food for his kids. If you just start lecturing him about climate change and what's going to happen to the planet 50 years from now, it's just not going to register. So part of what we have to do, I think, is to engage, talk about the science. By the way, I should have said as an aside, that riff on the price of gasoline, it's unfortunate that President Macron had not read this speech several months ago. But anyway, I'm going back now to President Obama. So part of what we have to do, I think, is to engage, talk about the science, talk about the concrete effects of climate change, but then we also have to recognize that this transition is not going to happen overnight, and you're not starting from scratch. People are locked into existing ways of doing business. There are going to be some compromises along the way. That's frustrating because the science tells us we don't have time to compromise. On the other hand, if we actually want to get something done, then we've got to take people's immediate current views into account. That's how we're going to move the ball forward. I'll give you just one example. And some folks, he meant in the audience, will push back. We significantly reduced the amount of power that we're generating from coal. Coal miners feel like they've been battered. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons why we've seen a significant reduction of coal usage in the United States is not regulations, it's because natural gas got cheap as a consequence of fracking. Now, there are a lot of environmentalists who absolutely object to fracking, and their attitude is we've got to leave that stuff in the ground. I get all that. On the other hand, the fact that we're transitioning from coal to natural gas means less greenhouse gases. Same thing with nuclear power. So I say all that not because I don't recognize the urgency of the problem. It's because we're going to have to straddle between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be and build that bridge. Better is good. Better is not always enough. Better is not always ideal. But each year we're doing something that's making more progress, moving us forward, increasing clean energy, then that's ultimately how we end up solving this problem. And that's when we can start creating political coalitions that will listen to us, because we're actually recognizing that some people have some real concerns. We got to make sure that they feel like they're being heard in this whole process. So I think, that was in 2016. He said, Green Real Deal. not popular many places. He recognized that. He acknowledged it. But I got to say, certainly one cannot question his commitment to addressing climate. And this is not to say that we don't want and don't need, frankly, those with voices, especially your young people who are skipping class every now and then, to make a very important protest against inaction on these issues. But it's also to us to try to engineer the real solutions that move us forward as fast as we can, even if, as the President says, it's not always as fast as we would like. So that was the prologue. I have a feeling I'm not going to give very much of this talk that I had prepared. Because now, okay, I'll give a snippet at least. Because I think we need to have time for questions. So what I will say a little bit about then is two reports that we have issued from the Energy Futures Initiative just in the last months, which we would say are perhaps retrospectively or retroactively part of the Green Real Deal. So one is this report, Optionality, Flexibility, Innovation. It's 331 pages. It's measured in kilograms, must be good. What it does is it's embodying all those things I said at the beginning in looking at California. Remember, we said you've got to look regionally. California is a region. It's a country. It's the 9th biggest economy in the world, fifth biggest economy in the world, whatever. And I do want to emphasize that the subtitle is Pathways for Deep Decarbonization, but the title is what we consider to be the key for actual solutions. It's optionality, flexibility, and innovation. That's really the core of what we need to do. So I think I've skipped, this just gives you an idea of this is a Sankey diagram of the energy flows of California, and I would say for now, only look at one thing. Notice petroleum, 48%. You're already seeing where the issue is, and in fact, here are California's emissions. They are exceptional for the United States. I remember I mentioned earlier electricity was 28% for the country. California, it's only 16%. Transportation is the big one, followed by industry. This is not a simple task to get after these. So what we did is, and I'm not going to go through a lot of the details given the time now. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I do have, because this is really important. This is like unpleasant truths. So, again, we hear a lot about simple solutions, all wind and solar. This is for 2017. Those red things are hour by hour solar production. Okay? And obviously you can tell there's day and night, right? The blue is wind. For this purpose, just notice that counting 1 through 90, that was the quarter of the year where there was essentially no wind in California, including at the end of the year, essentially 10 consecutive days of no wind. So, 4 hours of battery storage is great. But you want to run a system that has to be reliable all the time. You got a challenge to meet. In fact, here is a graph with hours of storage. Cal ISO, that's the one in the middle, actually has a somewhat better profile, but what you can see, it's 4 hours of storage. Other places typically have 1 or 2 hours of storage. So you need that for managing the up and down, but you also have, it's clear, we got to think about storage for lots and lots of different time scales. And yeah, we got to go through these, that's right. This is not solar or wind, this is hydro. Over several years, you can see from 2001 to 17. A lot of people don't realize hydro is an extremely volatile resource. And in particular, if we look at the 2011-2012, that was another drought period that was starting. You had a drop of 40% in 1 year, just in 1 year, and it kept going down for other years. But I point that out because it happened to be the same year that the San Onofre nuclear plant didn't produce anything, shut down. Suddenly you had 15% of the state's electricity gone 1 year to the next. What happened? Natural gas. You had the infrastructure, you had the supply. This is not an advertisement for natural gas. It's saying we have got to do serious system thinking about taking into account all of these kinds of questions. And finally, from this kind of reality check point of view, this is for a year, the measured, that's 3 years on there, but I mean for a year, let's say 2018, the measured solar generation and wind generation. If you look at the solar, while there would be little surprise in seeing what we saw earlier, there's sun in the day and there's not sun in the night, but we also forget, at our latitude, there's a lot more sun in the summer than there is in the winter, like more than a factor of 2. And in California, this is not the case everywhere, but in California, it also happens that the wind peaks in the summer by more than a factor of 2. So if we're going to drive the system to a very significant dependence on wind and solar, which is great, but we better now also solve seasonal storage, because you're going to have so much more production in the summer. So these are all the innovation challenges that we need to address. But it's a lot more complicated, frankly, than a lot of the discussions that we are hearing about addressing these issues. So finally, and again, I'm just not going to have time to go into much detail, but so what we did is we looked at 31 technology pathways and went bottom up as to what did we think were the millions of tons of CO2 emissions that could be avoided, could be reduced up to 2030, given reasonable assumptions about developments in the technologies. And we did it sector by sector, as you can see. I'm just going to point out a few things, because we don't have time to go through all of these, obviously. Number one, note that for electricity and industry, the biggest single reduction that we found would be carbon capture and sequestration if California started now only with the subset of, for example, in electricity, only with the subset of natural gas combined cycle plants that would not have a lot of ramping. For those who know the business, you'll understand that. But today, carbon capture and sequestration, certainly in California, is nowhere. And many want to rule it out as an option. Not a good idea. Secondly, if one looks at transportation and buildings, the longest pole in the tent is efficiency, energy efficiency. So for transportation, if California can hold to the light-duty vehicle so-called CAFE standards, energy efficiency standards, that is a big deal. California also has a goal of 5 million electric vehicles by 2030. Today they have light-duty vehicles. Today they have 30 million. They'll have 35 million. So essentially the growth in their plan is for electric vehicles. That's the third largest bar for transportation, following efficiency and low carbon fuels, which is a statutory requirement in California. So I think, going through the different technology pathways really kind of points you to things that you need to really pursue. I've already talked about all of those. So, well, I didn't talk about agriculture. Actually, agriculture is another tough sector. I would just say that one of the interesting approaches there is biogas, to capture it, avoid the emissions, and then have it used as a natural gas replacement in many areas. So that gives you a flavor of how we look at building up to 2030. And what I should have said and did not is, and you just trust me, if you add up all those bars, and you can't add them all up linearly, but if you add them all up, what you find is you just about make the 40% economy-wide reductions of CO2. But the message is, a very important message is, we can do it, but right now it's going to be a little bit expensive if we can't get those costs down, number one. And number two, we basically got to hit a home run in all of those. There isn't a lot of slack in there in order to be able to make that 40%. But it's doable, but it's going to need a concerted effort, and it's going to need what we call all of the above. You don't want to exclude carbon capture. We did exclude nuclear for California to 2030 because that's essentially by law not going to happen, although we do put it back in as an option for 2050 in California. And in fact, here, actually, no, this is first looking at industry. I don't want to. I can't spend time on this, but it gives you the flavor. Industry is a really tough sector. It adds up to a lot of emissions, and yet it's fragmented over many different kinds of industries. So it's not only sectoral here, but it's subsectoral. You're going to have to look at every one of these, and cement and food products and the refining industry, et cetera, to make progress there. And there's also the combustion and non-combustion emissions. Now, so this finally, I'll end for the 2030 at least, and just say that if we now go cross-sectoral, once again you see the role of efficiency. It's the dominant opportunity across multiple sectors. Transportation, as you can see, but then industry and buildings is where the big opportunity is. Fuel switching, and then as I've already said, things like carbon capture and sequestration can represent a non-trivial amount, but only if in that state there is a commitment right now to go aggressively for that. Okay, I'm going to skip this, but the message is here that there is policy for carbon capture and sequestration, and it would also tell you that industry is the lowest hanging fruit in order to be able to use that. For post-2030, as I said, we emphasize innovation. I showed you earlier that seasonal peaking of sun and wind in the summer, you could imagine, for example, that you do drive a system that way and use all the excess production in the summer. For example, one example, make hydrogen. Hydrogen is then a fuel that you can use in multiple sectors over the entire year. So it's kind of an existence proof, but once again, that hides a lot of big challenges, enormous infrastructure challenges in terms of a hydrogen economy. Right now, tremendous cost issues if you're going to make the hydrogen from electrolysis of water, and we can go on and on. But with innovation, I think there are a bunch of solutions. We wrote down a portfolio that we thought was especially important, and I'm just going to focus on one issue on the lower right, direct air capture, large-scale carbon management. Now, this is the real kind of long shot. But I will say that personally, I believe that we are going to need negative carbon technologies if we are going to make essentially an almost completely decarbonized or a so-called net neutral carbon economy by 2050. You can't do that without some negative carbon technologies. Now, in this cartoon, we say, okay, with capture, you could capture the CO2 from concentrated sources like power plants or industrial facilities, or dilute sources like the air or the ocean. If you've captured the carbon dioxide at large scale, you've got to do something with it. You can utilize it or you can store it, possibly a bit of both. In utilization, today, by the way, today we do a little bit of the bottom line: concentrated sources, enhanced oil recovery, and geological sequestration. But enhanced oil recovery is a drop in the bucket for the amount of CO2 we want to capture and dispose of. So we will have to develop the science, really the breakthrough science, to have very, very large-scale utilization of captured CO2 in products, like fuels would be ideal. Low or no carbon fuels. And storage, it can be geological, drill a hole, put it down in a deep aquifer. It can be through weathering of certain minerals, but it can also be biological. And I don't mean just trees, although that's part of it, plants and trees, but also genetic modification of plants to fix more carbon and the like. There's a whole palette here to be explored. And right now, certainly the federal R&D budget in this area is very, very minimal. So we will also be publishing a report in June that will put out an RD&D proposal for this whole area looking forward. And the suggestion will need mission innovation to work. We'll need a doubling of the R&D budget to be able to accommodate this properly. But these are the kinds of things with which I feel confident in saying, yeah, we can succeed, but we've got to work awfully hard, and we've got to innovate, again, like hell. All right, I'm going to end just with a quick statement. Energy security, we haven't talked about, but if this world evolves, clearly energy security issues will look very, very different. There's been a lot of focus on oil, obviously, for energy security, but here, the new energy security issues, if we have all of these advanced technologies depending upon often exotic minerals, that's where there's a huge issue. And again, I won't go through it, but the reality is that China has a tremendous position in terms of a lot of the minerals that one would like. Australia as well, which is, of course, we would call an ally. But this is a big issue evolving in terms of all of these various minerals, many of which we import 100% of our usage. So without going into detail, just say that it's an evolving issue that we'll have to be concerned about. And finally, well, actually, I should go back to that one though. Yeah. So there was a World Bank study, and there you can see the conclusions that a green technology future will be very intensive with these mineral requirements, and it's something that we have to start thinking about. There are also the human issues in terms of things like cobalt mining, but again, I think we don't have time to really focus on this. These are a set of recommendations in terms of supply chains. And okay, maybe the one that I will mention is that support new domestic mining activities, another unpopular subject. But the reality is This is about these minerals that, metals and things that are needed to drive these technologies. And so environmentally responsible mining is something that has to get onto the agenda. There's a lot of inconvenient truths. I apologize if I gave you too many of them, but that's really the case. Finally, we also did a report on the clean energy innovation landscape. I think I will perhaps stop at this point because I think time is running on. One point here is that there has been a substantial drop in venture capital funding in this space. Hopefully, this is going to turn around, but the technology risk profile, unfortunately, is not where it should be. It is worth mentioning that there are now all kinds of new players. This is no longer the incumbent energy companies' space to deal with. All kinds of IT companies. If you could read this, you would see that, but I'm going to pass on so that you can't. And just say that we make a bunch of recommendations in the report. I won't go over them now, but it's key for a better alignment than we currently have between what we call the players, the policies, and the programs for encouraging innovation, and especially for encouraging regional innovation initiatives that will be matched again to the unique solutions for those various parts of the country. So I'm sorry I took probably a little bit too much of your time with this, but hopefully gives you a flavor of how we think we need to go about pragmatically making real progress and not just talking about it, and sectoral studies and regional studies and coalitions, and surely innovation at the core is really the heart of what we think will win the day eventually. Thank you. Oh, I'll do as much as you want. I don't know how much they want.
Okay. Well, Professor Moniz wants to leave for an exercise for the students, that's you, the other 130 pages that he was going to cover here. So be sure to have that done by the time the class meets next time.
The two volumes add up to 550 pages. So.
There is a little time, maybe 5 minutes, for some quick questions and answers. If any of you would like to address those, please go to the microphone. Yeah, do you want to take it, Ernie?
Okay, fine.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Pamela Collins, Conservation International. So you talked a lot about supply, you talked a lot about technological solutions. You alluded briefly to efficiency as one source for demand reduction. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to your thoughts on other styles of demand reduction in terms of maybe changes in lifestyle, and then if you could also speak a little bit more about the role of ecosystem conservation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then also ecosystem restoration as an additional sequestration option.
So let me start with the latter. And I know Conservation International very well, by the way, I might add. What I call biological sequestration was a very broad statement about the many opportunities with ecological development, preservation, et cetera. I mean, certainly there are lots of there are lots of opportunities. I think not sufficiently well researched yet, in my view, but things like mangroves, for example, and coastal. It's called blue carbon, although I think it should be called green carbon because I think of green water and blue water. But anyway, but certainly managing our ecology more effectively is certainly a big opportunity for biological sequestration. As I said, there's that, and there is the possibility of also engineering certain grasses and the like with deeper roots, et cetera. But so certainly, I think, and in fact, actually, I'll go back to my days as Energy Secretary. The very last report I got from my advisory board, CAB, was on looking at gigaton opportunities for large-scale carbon management. And that report had as its principal finding the huge unexplored opportunities in the biological sphere to go forward. So we're very supportive of that. On efficiency and conservation, et cetera, yeah, we talked about energy efficiency, things like automobiles, buildings, and that is certainly very important. There are other opportunities in addition to, I'm not going to get into the lifestyle issues, although that's a huge issue. We could go off on that in a whole other thing. For example, how people of the world are going to get protein as economies develop across the world. It's not going to be by replacing our lifestyle because there isn't going to be enough farmland to get protein that way. But things like smart cities, really the full integration of IT opportunities in urban design, urban management, in behind-the-meter activities in homes and businesses. Those are all areas where the surface has barely been scratched, and efficiency is the long pole in the tent. I mean, efficiency meaning lower energy intensity is the long pole in the tent.
So let's take the two that are still remaining here. Quick questions, please, and comparable answers.
I apologize.
So efficiency and most of the things you listed there can address the 20 gigatons that we'll be adding each year, but aren't we going to still be adding heat to the system so long as there's still the 1,000 gigatons that we already put in the air? That efficiency wouldn't be able to help? And if there is a solution to address those 1,000 gigatons that's not efficiency, why don't we just do that as our solution?
Are you recommending direct air capture, for example?
Well, it just seems to me like everything else only solves 2% of the problem, the 20 gigatons that we're going to add each year. We still have 1,000 gigatons, 98% of the problem that we need something else for, that we need direct air capture for. So why wouldn't we only focus on the 98% that we still need to solve no matter what?
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding it, but look, the issue is that obviously we have increased carbon in the atmosphere substantially since the beginning of the industrial age, 275 to now 412 parts per million, and we've had roughly a degree centigrade of warming as a result. I think the issue now is we're trying to stabilize at least at 2 degrees. Obviously, there's a strong preference for 1.5 degrees, especially given the last report on the difference of 1.5 and 2. The way I look at it is, the old theory of holes, right? You find yourself in a hole, first you stop digging. And then you can start thinking about climbing out of the hole. Right now, we got a real challenge to stop digging. Frankly, if you're realistic about it, the trajectory we're on right now is not 2 degrees, it's closer to double that. So, and that's why it may sound contradictory that I'm arguing that we're going to have step-by-step hard work, roll up your sleeves, block and tackle, follow all these technology pathways, respect the needs of communities, the social equity part. And by the way, I say that not only because I think it's the right thing to do, but because, sorry, I'm getting away from your question, but because if we don't, all we get is political headwinds to go where we want to go. So we've got to take care of that. We can't have, head of one of the labor unions once said, when there's a change of policy and there are stranded assets of utility, the ratepayers pay for it, but nobody pays for the stranded workers or the stranded communities. And that's where we got to go. And that's when we get the coalitions put together to go as fast as we can. Now, eventually, and it is eventually, we may be able to go to the big scale negative carbon technologies. But look, today, there's a lot of argument, but certainly it's not crazy to say that capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is very, very low density, we said 4 and 10 parts per million, is very expensive, like $1,000 a ton. We got to get that cost way down through innovation. But secondly, we also haven't quite figured out what we would do if we captured hundreds of gigatons. We've got to do something with it. Now, I believe scientifically that geology is not the limit. But geology isn't the only thing. I think it's unclear to what extent it would be socially acceptable to be putting these huge amounts of CO2 underground. And that itself will have different political dynamics in different parts of the country. So I think you know, I mean, I'm completely sympathetic with what you're saying, but I think it's going to be a long time until we get to that place of scrubbing the atmosphere.
Just really quickly, I wanted to ask what would be your top couple of suggestions on what I could do as an individual on a day-to-day level in my personal life to participate in this New Deal?
Well, it's always, you know, adding up the activities of individuals, but I'm going to answer in the following way. And John Kerry and I did a little opinion piece in the USA Today, one of the great academic journals of our time, on Earth Day, a couple 10 days ago, whatever it was. And the point there was we hearkened back, first of all, 49 years to the original Earth Day, and noted how, of course, you know, 20 million Americans, in a certain sense, mobilized and got the message, you know, it was primed, but got the message to the political sphere that there was going to be accountability. And, you know, you had pretty diverse political figures, you know, Gaylord Nelson to Richard Nixon, who played roles. In a few years, National Environmental Protection Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, creation of EPA, there was political accountability. And if you go back to looking at what happened to individuals at that time, individual politicians, and their success or lack of success in elections, there was political accountability. That people were fed up, it was time to address these issues of health and everything else. My answer to you is 49, 50 years later, I believe the level of public concern, despite all we hear the deniers and this kind of stuff, the level of public concern that we see, recognizing that something needs to be done, is incommensurate with the level of political accountability. What we need to do is to recreate that dynamic of 50 years ago and saying that, look, you know, and it's exactly what you know, Greta in Sweden and the young people are saying. We're fed up with inaction. And we have to hold people accountable for this because the stakes are very, very, very high.
Well, Bill Carey would be pleased. So please join me in congratulating Ernie Moniz and join us out in the outer lobby.